So Merry Christmas Eve. And if you live here in our area, Merry White Christmas Eve. And I'm sorry if you don't like it. But you can just feel good at least that it makes some of us so happy. Childlike again. So one of my favorite authors is a Franciscan priest. His name is Richard Rohr. He's written the book Immortal Diamond and many other books, but he is what I consider to be a truth teacher. He goes into the mystical, the metaphysical. He goes into the heart of what spirituality brings. And although a lot of Christianity stops at a literal teaching of Jesus, the mystical tradition in all deep spiritual practices goes to something even deeper than a story about a beautiful man of God consciousness born onto this planet. And it goes into a story about you. And so what Richard Rohr teaches is the same thing that Charles Fillmore taught, which is about what he calls the cosmic Christ. The cosmic Christ is the Christ that was developed in Jesus, that came along with Jesus. He discusses the idea that as Jesus lived 2,000 years ago, as Jesus the man was here, so was there too the advent on earth of the Christ consciousness, this cosmic Christ consciousness. He says they are two things that became one and embodied in a person on this planet so that we could all see and witness and demonstrate and know this truth of our being, this truth of spirituality that can inform and lift up the human condition to take it out of limitation and into spiritual practice. Now, this tradition taught as a Franciscan priest is a beautiful development in the expression of what Catholicism is and what other spiritual traditions is. It's like if you weave these traditions together, you will see these truths. And that's how Charles Fillmore actually came up with the idea of unity, and the name unity was because he looked at spiritual traditions and he said, if there is truth to be found here, I should be able to find it anywhere. It should be able to be demonstrated. I should see it in cultures, in traditions, and in spiritual practices around the world and in the heart of all people. It should be able to be discovered and found. So Richard Rohr, who speaks about the universal awakening within mystical and transformational traditions, says this: Advent is not about a sentimental waiting for the baby Jesus. He asserts that Advent is a time to focus our expectations and our anticipations on the adult Christ, the cosmic Christ. He says this Christ challenges us to empty ourselves, to lose ourselves, to surrender. He says that Jesus and Christ did come together, but Christ existed for all eternity. The Christ beyond Christianity is the one he is talking about, this cosmic Christ. And as Paul said, in the end, there is only the Christ. And it's in everything. And that there's a groaning of this birthing of the Christ consciousness. And this birthing and this groaning is through all of creation. He says that the height of Christian seeing is to see God in everything. The height of Christian seeing is to see God in everything. He said, when you don't see God in everything, you end up seeing God in nothing. When you don't see God in everything, you end up seeing God in nothing. And then he goes on in one of the talks that I heard to talk about how wisdom traditions and ancient traditions personalize all of the elements, that even the very elements of the earth, even the very elements around us, they personalize them. Even calling brother, sun, sister, moon, those connections of knowing that we are kindred spirits, that we are all of the same force field, that this is part of the practice of seeing God in everything, and that this is our opportunity for spiritual growth and awakening. One of my favorite things about being here at the Village is being able to tie in Charles Fillmore and the history of old with our language of today. And I always love at Christmas time pulling out Charles Fillmore's old talks. So this is one of his talks from December 19th, 1923. A Christmas time sermon that he gave. And he would write out these lessons, and they were almost like lectures that you would hear in a school. But one of the things that I noted in this one from 1923 is how he loves to go for the history. He loves to make sure when he talks about Christmas to tie in what we know about Christmas so that people don't have to be in a place where they turn off the thinking brain, turn off the science brain, turn off the history brain in order to get a spiritual practice where they can actually look at the history. So he goes in to this, talking about the pagan rituals and how we got the date December 25th and how that had nothing to do with really when Jesus was born, but Mithra and all of the other traditions that come together about Kris Kringle and Santa Claus and the Christmas tree. He loves going into defragmenting the history of what is passed down to us. Not, friends, to invalidate it, but to get us to focus on what is important to us and why this story comes to us and how even those things can come together to create an even more beautiful and deep picture of unity. Of unity. He says this in 1923, metaphysicians do not, as a rule, give much attention to the historical part of any celebration or observance. But it seems to me that in order to understand the metaphysical or spiritual side of a proposition, that we should know something about its history, why we celebrate it, and where the celebration originated, whether it came direct from spirit or is the result of evolution. He loves diving in to the story that became our history. In his talk from December of 1930, he says this, in referring to bringing it to today, bringing it to you, bringing it to me, stepping out of history and making it real right now. He says, do we get this inner quickening of a great ideal? And let the sense mind, the Herod, kill it, destroy it. We have to watch ourselves very closely in this bringing forth of this new idea of man. Now, the birth of Jesus in this humble way back, say 2,000 years ago, represents the birth of the Christ idea or the perfect man, which was created as a potential principle in every one of us. But it must come, he says, to conscious mind. It must come to conscious mind. He goes on to say, we have not had the right idea, all of us, about Jesus Christ. This is in the early 1900s. We have not had the right idea, all of us, about Jesus Christ. The world over, people are celebrating today the birth of Jesus of Nazareth. It is all right as far as it goes, but it doesn't mean very much to you or me unless we know that we have that same birth in us. And if it is, we must go on with this development of the divine idea, this Word of God. He is always bringing us back to the true spiritual practice, to awakening the presence within. No doubt this year, each one of us has taken a trip to Bethlehem. No doubt on your human and spiritual journey this year, you have taken the trip to Bethlehem, been exhausted, been turned away, had to be stronger than you thought was possible, had to take a stand, be rejected, had to be called higher, felt unsafe, alone, or abandoned, had to create your safety when outer conditions gave you none, and finally, slept in the stable where miracles are born. You've been on your own journey of struggle and triumph that called forth the highest spiritual practice. A practice that may have challenged what you know, challenged who you thought you were and what you were capable of. We too as a community are on this trip, building a community that has a wanting to grow and has miracles in store to be unfolded. One of the greatest gifts of Christmas and the birthing of the Christ is expectation, the hope that is here. Sometimes you have to really work at keeping this hope alive, at stewarding it, at caring for it, nurturing it, protecting it. Sometimes it doesn't feel easy, and sometimes it's not easy. Yet the spiritual journey is the unfolding of this awakened consciousness. It's the practice of the presence. One of my favorite Christmas talks from Fillmore is from 1912. He says, "Today, all over this land, the birth of Jesus is being celebrated in Christmas sermons and Christmas carols. Nearly all of these celebrations have as their central idea a man named Jesus who was born in Judea nearly 2,000 years ago. I presume that I could count on the fingers of my hands the place in this land where the real understanding of the birth of Christ is preached and taught. So many years we have had ingrained and inground into us the idea of a historical event, that it is difficult to erase from our minds that teaching, that idea, that it is a celebration of something that took place in the past, but it is not of vital import to every individual in the present. Now, in our lesson this morning, you will observe that it is prominently brought out in its various symbolic details that the historical Jesus Christ was symbolical of a change, of a new step forward in the soul of every man and every woman who realizes the truth of their being. The scriptures so clearly portray in these symbols that when one reads it in the spirit, it seems wonderful to anyone who could have misconstrued that record, have gone into mere historical observance of the birth of Jesus Christ. If it were mere history, we would be celebrating greater men in their time. If it were mere history, we would be celebrating greater men of their time, the birth of greater men. Alexander the Great was greater in his day, far greater than Jesus Christ. Even Herod, the ruler of Judea, was greater in his day than Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ was not a great man to his followers, to his fellows, rather. He didn't have over a dozen students that were in understanding of him. In his day, he didn't have over a dozen students who were in understanding of him. He was a wanderer up and down the earth without a place to lay his head. A teacher of strange doctrine. We're here today. If he were here today, he would be considered a crank. And yet, that man's teaching has spread around the world and is written about and talked about more than any teaching of any man that ever lived. And why is this? It is because he was a supreme. Is it because he was a supreme man as a man? Why, no. He must have represented a principle. His teaching couldn't have continued as it has. It couldn't have taken such possession of men's minds all these ages and grown and increased if it were not founded on the principle that applies to every and all. He goes on to say what we must do, what we are called to do with this teaching, with this principle that was demonstrated, has life, and can be learned. He says, you must read between the lines. You must read as one who sees spiritually and gradually eliminate all the factors of personality, of history. Forget about Euclid when you demonstrate his propositions. Look at the necessary factors. But it says, but he should not include so much of his personal life as to shut out the working in you of the principle. Don't focus, he's saying, so much on the history that you forget about the message, the working in you of the principle. When we study the life of Jesus Christ and celebrate his birthday, it should not be with that external consciousness that thinks about history, but a deeper understanding of that immortal man, the great principle which existed in the mind of the Father from the beginning, which Jesus Christ flashed forth. And many other great ones have lighted the world with. He goes on to say, Christ doesn't express himself in your consciousness all at once, like a conversion and a revival, but you catch the light, you see the possibility, and this conceives in your soul a larger consciousness of yourself. The soul is typified in the history of Jesus Christ as Mary. The soul is typified in the history of Jesus Christ as Mary, the feminine principle in all. And it first gets the idea of the possibility of a larger consciousness, a greater man. And in due season, this man is brought forth, is expressed. He is expressed in the body. We have thought that this Christ consciousness, this forming of the Christ in you, is to be done in some miraculous way. But no, it comes under a law. And that law is unknown to us, working itself out in what we call the subconscious mind. He goes on to tell us what it requires of us to develop in this principle under this law. It requires patience in the development and growth of the Christ man. It requires watchfulness, culture, but above all, a firm conviction that the Christ is being formed in me. So how will we support within ourselves the development of patience for the growth of this cosmic consciousness within us? How will we quicken our own faculty of watchfulness that we may be mindful and aware? And how will we deepen our faith, our hope, and our conviction, as Charles Fillmore says, our conviction that the Christ is being formed in me? How can we, beyond all appearances, hold to that truth so that we can look out of anything happening externally and happening within our lives and saying the Christ cosmic force is being formed in me now, and create that in our spiritual practice? He says the Christ idea is like a star in the consciousness of man. It seems a way off, but it always hangs over the place where the child is being brought forth. This star, which seems to you so distant, is the first gleam of light. And as you think more and more about the Christ being formed in you, that star comes closer and closer. And finally, it takes up its abode in you, and your very body is alight with the light which seemed so distant, which seemed on the outside. It becomes an inner light. And this is the forming in you of the substance of life, of the omnipresent principle of man. He quotes one of the old writers who said, "Though Christ 1,000 times in Bethlehem be born, he is not born in thee. If he is not born in thee, thy soul is forlorn." If the Christ of God is not born in you, Fillmore says, you miss the mark of the high calling. You miss the understanding of this celebration. What a Christmas message. What power when it's taken to heart as a spiritual practice, as a way that one sees not only themselves, but sees all of creation. and creates through that power of seeing. Eckhart Tolle, one of the current masters of light and teaching of spiritual principle and practice and awakening, says this about Christmas. He says, in the history of Christianity, if you believe you are the sole possessor of the truth, then that belief has the power to corrupt your actions, even to the point of insanity, whether it's the Catholic Inquisition or a big shopping spree. The truth is inseparable from who you are. If you look for it in ideas, beliefs, or even gifts from the store, you will be deceived every time. The true meaning of Christmas is that the very being that you are is truth. This is what Jesus meant when he said, I am the way and the truth and the life. Jesus speaks of the inner essence identity of every human being. Some Christian writers call this the Christ within. The real meaning of Christmas is to find that essential self that is universally experienced as the Christ within, no matter what your culture or religious upbringing is. And to close with words of Richard Rohr. The problem is solved. Now go and utterly enjoy all the remaining days. Not only is it always Advent, but every day can now be Christmas, because the one we thought we were waiting for has come once and for all. Namaste.